Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides. Thank you. Okay, so we've got three different topics we're covering with today's virtual conversation: parking, landscape and screening, and open space. Before we get started, just a quick review of how this virtual conversation will work. We'll narrate a presentation, and as we go along, if you have comments or questions about the material that we're covering, you can enter them into the chat feature of Zoom, and our team will try to keep up and respond to comments as we see them in the chat if we can. And at the end, if we have time, we will go back and try to respond to any comments or questions that may not have been addressed as we went along. So just kind of as an icebreaker and to get everybody used to using the chat feature, by now you're probably all experts at it, but if you will, just go in and into chat now and tell us your name, and if you're representing an organization or a company or a firm or any other affiliation you'd like to tell us about, just put that in the chat now, just so it will be part of our record for this meeting, and we'll be able to know who's here and any organizations or affiliations you may wish to share with us. So what we hope you'll get out of today's virtual conversation is an understanding of where to find the requirements for these three elements of the UDO: parking, landscaping and screening, and open space. Learn what is covered in each of the articles generally, and then we'll also do a pretty high-level review of some of the specific requirements for each of these areas. This 1 hour virtual conversation is not intended by any means to be a substitute for actually opening up the UDO and getting into the details if that's what you need to know about. So we're not going to get deeply into the details of all of these requirements because some of them are rather involved, but this is rather more of a high-level review. So just real quick schedule discussion. We have released, as you know, the first draft of the UDO. We're now in the midst of receiving public comments and engagement. This schedule may be adjusted somewhat, but for as of now, this is what our schedule looks like. We are asking for public comments to be submitted by January 14th, and we'll incorporate those into subsequent drafts, and ultimately leading to an adoption, we hope, by the City Council of this UDO in July. So let's get right into the material now. We'll start out with parking. And the parking requirements are found in Article 19 of the UDO. It's in Part 8, which is still part of the zoning standards section of the UDO. In Article 19, you'll find the various parking standards, and you can see kind of a screenshot there of the table of contents of the UDO. So this is where you'll be able to look and find what you're looking for, hopefully, in the entire UDO. Just start out with the table of contents right at the beginning. So the parking requirements in the UDO are using a three-tier system that's based on zoning districts. So before we dig into that, I thought it would be helpful to just review what the proposed zoning districts are in the UDO. If you're not familiar with them, if you haven't been to any of our other meetings or conversations, this may be new to you. We have divided the proposed zoning districts into three general categories: neighborhood, employment, and centers, and they're each found in a different part of the UDO, either Part 3, Part 4, or Part 5. They are Neighborhood 1 and Neighborhood 2 zoning districts, and then in the employment districts, there are commercial, campus, manufacturing and logistics, and innovation mixed use. And then our centers districts have neighborhood centers, community activity centers, regional centers, transit-oriented development, and then we also have a manufactured home park district. So that's just an overview. Now, the parking requirements in the UDO, I mentioned we're using a 3-tier system. This is something new for us, where according to zoning district, you would fall into either tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. They are different, and we'll go over the differences and what's included in each of those 3 tiers in the upcoming slides. So tier 1, which you can think of as our most auto-oriented, least walkable districts as a rule. In the districts in here would be the manufacturing and logistics 1 and 2, the institutional campus 1, the office flex campus, the manufactured home park district, all of our neighborhood 1 districts, and our neighborhood 2A and 2B districts. For these tier 1 districts, there will be a minimum requirement, a minimum parking requirement for off-street parking, but no parking maximums. And typically you can see what some of those minimum parking requirements would be. For example, for a single family home, it would be 2 spaces. For a manufactured home, it would be 1 per unit and so forth. A typical non-residential minimum parking would be 1 space per 500 square feet of floor area of that use, but that's just a broad generality. Different uses would have different minimum parking requirements based on their nature. For example, some things like a car wash may not have a minimum parking requirement. Our tier 2 zoning districts would be the innovation mixed use, the institutional campus 2, neighborhood center, the neighborhood 2C district, our 2 commercial districts, and our community activity center 1. Tier 2 has both a minimum parking and a maximum parking standard.
Alan, I think we lost you.
No, excuse me, I had to stifle a cough and get something to drink.
No worries.
So as I was saying, in the tier 2 districts, you would have both a minimum and a maximum requirement. And then finally in our tier 3, which tend to be our most urban and most walkable areas, the zoning districts in tier 3 are all of our transit-oriented development districts, our urban center, our urban edge, our community activity center 2 district, and the regional activity center. And generally speaking, uses in the tier 3 districts will have no minimum parking requirements, but rather instead they will have maximum parking requirements. There is an exception to that. There would be minimum parking requirements for certain uses if you're within 200 feet of neighborhood 1 zoning. And that would be things like multifamily residential or live performance venues, nightclubs, breweries, that kind of thing that are apt to generate parking demand in close proximity to lower density residential neighborhoods. Other standards in the parking are how parking spaces are calculated. It's based on the use, generally speaking. And when minimum parking spaces are required, that is either with the new construction of a principal building, or if an existing building is expanded that requires more than 10 additional parking spaces, or a change of use resulting in a requirement for more than 10 additional parking spaces. Some parking spaces are exempt from parking maximums, And these include any required ADA spaces, any electric vehicle EVSE installed spaces. We'll talk about EVSE in a minute. Pickup and drop off parking spaces for things like ride hailing services or deliveries. Any on-street parking spaces are exempt from the maximums. And then for townhomes and multifamily, you can have visitor parking spaces that may exceed the parking maximums. So something new for the UDO is a requirement in some cases for electric vehicle charging stations. And there are 3 types of EV charging stations that are covered here. One is an EV capable, which simply means that you make room in the electrical panel and you install a raceway from the panel out to where your future EV parking would be. Another is the second level is EV ready, where you actually put a 240 volt outlet accessible to those parking spaces. And then the highest level is EVSE installed, which is the installation of an actual level 2 charging station. So now that we understand what the 3 levels are, we do have requirements for EV charging for a limited number of uses. And these are any multifamily stacked dwellings, the residential part of a mixed use development, also for hotels, and for either parking lots or parking structures if they are the principal use. So these are the kinds of things that we think are going to generate the highest demand right now for some EV charging. And as I said, they don't count toward the parking maximums. And you can see the table on the slide, which is actually taken right from the UDO. It's table 19-2, will tell you that based on the number of parking spaces provided, how many of those spaces, if any, are required to be either EV capable, EV ready, or EV installed. And as you can see, you don't trigger a requirement for an actual EVSE level 2 charger until you provide at least 26 parking spaces, and then in which case you have to provide one. And then as your parking gets bigger, you provide more of those EV charging. You'll also find in the parking article, Article 19, standards for the location and access of surface parking. There's a table that is based on zoning districts, table 19.4. There's a sample on the screen. It's quite detailed. I won't go into all of the details. But just to give you an overview of what's included in the parking article. So we're just going to go through that. We're not going to get too deeply into the standards. You'll also find standards for the design of parking structures. And there are various options for the design of parking structures based on the frontage type, and we won't get too deeply into the frontage type, as well as the zoning district. Article 19 also includes a required bicycle parking, and bicycle parking, just like vehicle parking, may be required with new construction of a principal building or expansion or a change of use. And bike parking can be divided into either short-term or long-term bicycle parking. In most cases, there will be a requirement for both short-term and long-term. And there is also a minimum and in some cases a maximum requirement for the bicycle parking that is required. So just some standards that you will find either in the UDO or in the Charlotte Land Development Standards Manual. The drawing on the upper left of this slide is taken from the Land Development Standards Manual, and it's a standard for one of the approved bike racks that could be approved by the city. It's also got standards for bike lockers, and you see an example of one of those in the center photo. And there is some flexibility for the design of bike racks. And the example on the right is a good example of that. It's not one of the city standards, but it was approved by the city for use. So there is some flexibility in the type that can be used. And just as with the parking requirements for vehicles, there is a table that goes over the required bicycle parking according to the use. It is divided into the number of short-term and number of long-term. Usually the long-term bike parking requirement is expressed as a percentage of the overall required bike parking. So that is a quick overview of Article 19, the vehicle and bicycle parking requirements. Our next topic is landscaping and screening, and you'll find that predominantly in Article 21 of the UDO. That's also in Part 8 of the General Development Zoning Standards. And you can see a little bit of what is in Article 21, a number of different topics. And we'll cover most of those as we go through the next several slides. But first of all, why do we have landscaping screening standards? Well, we want to preserve and enhance the appearance and character of our city, but also increase the compatibility of adjacent uses and minimize any adverse impacts that some uses may have on neighboring uses, and then to create transitional areas between uses of different intensities. So the types of landscaping and screening that's covered in Article 21 are parking lot perimeter landscaping, parking structure landscaping, landscape yards, which in our current zoning ordinance are called buffers. In the UDO, they're called landscape yards. And then screening for specifically loading areas and solid waste services. The landscape article, Article 21, also covers the selection, installation, and maintenance of landscape material. And it also refers to the aforementioned Charlotte Land Development Standards Manual. The two things that you're seeing on the screen now are both excerpted from the Land Development Standards Manual. There's a sample tree planting detail on the left, and then on the right is where you'll find the approved plant species list that is maintained by the city. So required plantings have got to be from this approved plant species list. I think we had a question on where to find this at a previous conversation. It is actually in the Land Development Standards Manual. Something new in the UDO is a requirement for species diversity of landscape plant material based on the number of plantings. There may be a requirement to create a diversity among plantings to risk losing plants to disease, for example. So this is something new. You'll see that here. And there's also requirements for how to maintain required landscaping material, including removal and replacement of any landscape material that dies or is seriously damaged. Parking lot perimeter landscaping, surface parking lots are required to be screened at the edge of the parking lot. And this screening is required for parking lots of 10 spaces or more, and also for any driveways or maneuvering areas that are located within the setbacks. And it's required when a new principal building is constructed or parking spaces are added, 10 or more, or if at least 50% of that surface parking lot is reconstructed. Reconstructed doesn't mean necessarily just repaving or restriping, but actual regrading and reconstruction is how that is defined. There are exceptions for when you have to provide parking lot perimeter landscaping. If you've got shared parking between properties, for example, you're not required to screen the edge of that. If there's a landscape yard required, you may not be required to provide the parking lot screening. Also for vehicle dealerships, for example, like the one on the screen, you're not required, or they are not required to screen the display parking areas of their dealership. Obviously, they want people to be able to see the kinds of cars that they're selling. And then also not required if the site abuts another property, if the zoning administrator determines there wouldn't be any meaningful purpose to have that screening there. So a way out for that. Generally speaking, the parking lot landscape perimeter area has to be 5 feet wide, a little wider if there are wheel stops or curbs, evergreen shrubs, and you can see some of the standards for the shrubs that are required. And there are a couple of options for screening parking lots. One is just using the landscape screening. Another is to use a shorter wall in addition to some small shrubs and ground cover. And you can also have part of that screen wall be a seating wall if that's what you want to do with that. So all of that is covered in Article 21 of the UDO. There's also requirements for landscaping of parking structures. And you can see some examples there and some handy graphics in the UDO. And you'll find additional information. I'm not going to get into all the details of screening of parking structures, but obviously the goal is to provide and soften the edge of those parking structures. And landscape yards. And I mentioned earlier that these are currently called buffers in our zoning ordinance, but in the UDO, they will be called landscape yards. And in certain uses or zoning districts, these may be required with the construction of a new building or the addition to a building, possibly a new use that is primarily an outdoor use that may be added to a site may trigger the requirement for a landscape yard, or a change of use category may also trigger a requirement for a landscape yard. There are 3 different types of landscape yards in the UDO, A, B, and C. And these vary, and they will be determined. We'll see in I think the next slide, how we can determine whether a use would require, a site would require an A, B, or C. But generally speaking, the A would be a wider landscape yard. And then the B is 25 feet wide and the C is only 10 feet wide. The width of the A depends on the size of the site. It could be anywhere from 40 feet all the way up to 100 feet wide for very large sites. They are required to be landscaped, and this table will talk about all of the landscape requirements for the 3 categories of landscape yard, as well as any requirements or standards for fences or walls that may be used in the landscape yard. So I mentioned that the Class A landscape yard is the widest of them, and it has 2 zones. An interior zone, which is the one closest to the perimeter of the site. That's zone 1, which is more heavily landscaped. And then zone 2 has a less intense landscape requirement. I won't go all into that. That's covered in the ordinance, but there is a graphic that helps explain that, the difference between zone 1, which is 25 feet, and then zone 2 is whatever the remainder of that Class A buffer landscape yard rather would be. And finally, a table that will tell whether a landscape yard is required, and if so, whether it is the A, B, or C variety of the landscape yard. And this will vary depending on the zoning of the property that's being developed, the type of development that's going on that property, and what type of property or use it abuts. So you probably can't read all of this, but you can go certainly into the UDO and look at this yourself and figure out how you can determine whether you need a Class A, B, or C buffer or landscape yard. I'm sorry, I'm so used to calling them buffers. Finally, some graphics, and this is just an example that you'll find in the UDO showing the general location of where the landscape yards are required. So we'll move from landscaping into screening, which is also in Article 21 of the UDO, and specifically talk about the screening of loading areas first. In all districts, except for our manufacturing and logistics districts 1 and 2, exterior loading areas need to be screened from streets and frontages and along any required side and rear setbacks with a opaque wall or 75% opaque wall or fence between 6 and 8 feet in height. In those 2 manufacturing and logistics districts, which are kind of our equivalent to our existing industrial districts, exterior loading areas that are to the side or the rear of buildings are not required to be screened. But any loading areas that are visible from the public or network required streets have to install screening at a parking lot type of screening, which we've already talked about. And then internal loading areas have got to be screened with a door, which must be closed when not in use. The screening of large waste containers, dumpsters, and the like, recycling stations and solid waste service areas are also covered in this article. Generally speaking, these uses have got to be, or these equipment and so forth have got to be screened with a 75% opaque fence wall or wall extension that should be a minimum of 1 foot above the height of the container up to 2 feet above the height of the container that's being screened. It has to be gated. The gate has to be either between 6 and 8 feet high, must be a solid gate. You can see a photo example there of a screen that would meet, I think, these requirements. And obviously the dumpsters or whatever is being screened in there need to be kept in those enclosures with the gate closed when not being serviced. The landscape article of the UDO does provide the zoning administrator with some flexibility to modify the landscape or screening requirements if the site has unusual topography or elevation or soil or any other subsurface conditions on the site that would prevent meeting the ordinance requirements. If there are some alternative proposed requirements that meet the intent of either the landscape or screening. So there is some flexibility for the zoning administrator to consider alternative solutions if the site doesn't permit meeting the requirements. Finally, our last topic is open space. And this is covered in several parts of the UDO. The design of open space is in Article 16.4, which is again found in Part 8 of the General Development Zoning Standards of the UDO. But the individual zoning districts may also have open space requirements. So you need to look in both places. You need to look in the zoning districts for the site that you're developing or looking at, as well as Article 16.4 to learn about the required design of any required open space. So table 16.1, and we'll have an example of that in a couple of slides. We'll talk about the design of open space, and there are 3 types of open space, either public open space, common open space, or private open space. Just want to point out that things like driveways, sidewalks, parking areas, bike parking, mailboxes, other things don't count toward the required on-site open space. And there are some uses that are exempt from any open space requirements, and those would be anything in the open space, recreation, or agricultural use categories of the use matrix, as well as infrastructure uses or transportation uses. So in order to figure that out, you need to go to Article 15, which covers uses, and it breaks down the various uses into broader categories. And so if your use is in one of those broader categories, open space, recreation, and so forth, it probably does not have an open space requirement. So the open space requirements are a little bit different for the neighborhood zoning districts and the other districts. So I've separated them into two different slides so you can see a little bit clearer what they may be. And generally speaking, open space is required for new development or expansion of a certain size of a building. And in neighborhood zoning districts, any required open space can either be private, common, or public open space, or any combination of those. So you can see that for most of our neighborhood 1 districts, N1A through N1E, we don't have an open space requirement for any single family duplex, triplex, or quadruplex dwellings. And nor do we have one for multifamily or townhouse because those uses generally aren't permitted in those districts. But then if you go over to the N1F district where we do permit those multifamily and townhouse, you'll see that there is a requirement for multifamily stacked, which is a percentage of the lot area. But then for either multifamily attached or townhouse, the open space requirement is based on the number of units and a certain square feet per unit. So in the case of N1F, it's 250 square feet per unit. And then as you get into the neighborhood 2 districts, N2A, N2B, and N2C, the 10% requirement for multifamily stacked carries across, but the per unit for multifamily attached in town home or townhouse is 250 square feet per unit in N2A, but goes down to 150 square feet for the N2B and N2C districts. And then the bottom 2 lines for any non-residential development or mixed-use development that may occur in any of those neighborhood districts, there is a 10% requirement for open space for any site greater than a ½ acre. And then our employment and center zoning districts, the open space is dealt with a little bit differently. Again, it's triggered by new development or a change of use or expansion. It doesn't apply to smaller sites of a ½ acre or less. And the way that it's figured for each of these zoning districts, and you can see the various zoning districts across the top, the next line down is the total on-site open space that's required. So just taking, for example, the first column, our 2 commercial districts, CG and CR, there would be a requirement to set aside 5% of the site as open space. And of that, 50%, if you're doing commercial development, has to be public open space. You can see that as you go down the table. So you've got, according to the development type, whether it's commercial development, mixed use development, or in the case of campus districts, campus development, those numbers, the 50s and the 25s, are a percent of the total required open space that has to be public for each of those development types. So generally speaking, the open space requirement is going to be 10% of the total lot area with some exceptions, but generally speaking, it's 10%. And generally speaking, if you're doing commercial development in those districts, 50% of that 10% has got to be public open space. And then for mixed use, it is either 25% of that 10%. So just so that you're not confused about these numbers, we're not saying 50% of the site has to be open space. We're saying 50% of the required either 10% or 5% has to be public open space. Excuse me. And then There is increased flexibility in the UDO for the design of open space over what may be in our current ordinance. And depending on whether the open space is public, common, or private. For example, in either or all three of those types, the required open space can be located on decks, galleries, porches, terraces, patios, or rooftops. So that is something that's a little bit new. And then for private open space, for multifamily and townhouse dwellings, the private open space doesn't have to be in a yard per se, but could also be on a balcony, a porch, or a deck. So that is that concludes the material part of the presentation. I want to wrap up with a couple of kind of housekeeping slides just to let you know that we're still in the comment period for the draft UDO. If you haven't found it already and you want to provide us with comments, we are asking that you do that through our online portal, which is available through our website, charlotteudo.org. And you will see a place where you can click where it says in that big orange box, now available, Unified Development Ordinance, and you click there. It will take you down to the next page where you can read the various pieces and parts of the UDO. You can actually just get down to the specific article that you're interested in looking at, and then provide comments on that article. So we're asking that you provide your comments only using the online portal. That way we are going to be able to record them, publish them so that everybody can see all other comments that are being made, as well as our responses. And we will attempt to respond to all of the comments that we receive. The UDO is a pretty big document. So to help, we've created a 26-page reference guide, which is a just really high level overview of each of the articles in the UDO. So if you don't want to dig in all 600 pages, the 26-page reference guide is a good place to start. You'll also find that on our website under the Helpful Resources tab at the top of our homepage. And again, just to cover where we are, we released the first draft of the UDO on October 7th. We're currently receiving feedback from the community and going through some community engagement activities, such as today's virtual conversation. We've had some both virtual and in-person meetings in the past several months and weeks. We'll be accepting comments on this first draft until January 14th, although as I mentioned at the beginning, we're currently talking about possibly altering the schedule to provide a little bit more time, more to come on that. And then if you haven't signed up for updates, I urge you to do that at our website so that when we do push out new information, you'll be sure to get it. So we are getting toward the end of our virtual conversation series. We're currently, I think, on the 10th of the 12 that we've scheduled. I want to point out that there had been a frequent users Q&A session that was scheduled for this past Tuesday that has been rescheduled for January 27th. We'll be doing this same conversation this evening at 6 o'clock. We'll cover the same material. And then next Tuesday, we will have a virtual conversation that covers required new streets, improvements, and associated standards. And as you know, you do need to register for these virtual conversations ahead of time. You can do it right up until the minute before the conversation starts to get the Zoom link to join and participate. So I'd like to thank you all. I have not been able to monitor the chat while I've been walking through the slides, and so I see we've got quite a bit in the chat. So I'm going to ask someone from our team who may want to jump in and talk about chat or where we left off and anything else that we may need to address.
So Alan, I think as you've been presenting, we have had members of Camaros as well as our team replying to the chat. So I'm not
Okay.
sure if there was anything that has yet been missed. There have been a couple of suggestions as well.
Okay, great.
We kind of kept up with it. Yes, I think we're caught up. Aaron Gillespie made a suggestion. I suggest extending the public comment period to be open through that reschedule of frequent users Q&A. Thank you, Aaron, for that suggestion. And I will reiterate what Alan spoke about for the frequent users Q&A. We definitely need those questions to come through to warrant an hour's worth of conversation. So if you are a frequent user of the UDO, please take the time to submit those questions so that we can have a robust conversation. That is our goal. If anyone else has questions that you'd like answered, you can drop those in the chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand, I do have the ability to unmute you if you'd like to do it that way as well. And we do, just for the collective, capture the chat so that we can take these suggestions back. We document them as well. This, I believe Alan did mention, is recorded, will be available online, as are our previous sessions and the subsequent sessions to come, so that you may watch it back or share it cross-platform. We do have a question from Eddie Moore. What research was done requiring / warranting EV stations for MF stacked dwellings? Not sure who would be best to reply to that. I don't know if that's Arista or Chris or someone from our team. Laura, possibly step in.
I can talk a little bit about the research that we did. So we were a part of a it was sort of a forum for cities to talk about best practices and different approaches to EV charging standards across the country, and as a part of our American Cities Climate Challenge grant. And we learned a lot there about sort of what other cities are requiring and what types of developments folks or cities are requiring EV charging for. And we really did find that the recommended best practices was to include EV standards for places where people work and where they live, because those are where you can get the most opportunity to charge your vehicle. So we really focused on a lot of those kind of multifamily. We saw that as a good opportunity because if you live in a multifamily building, you don't own your driveway like you would if you have a single family home. And so there may be less opportunity if you live there to have access to EV charging. So that's kind of a first take. We definitely did have some research from other cities that pointed to those developments. So it wasn't done without some basis, but that's what I'll say. I don't know, Alan, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think you covered it fairly well. Thank you. You know, it's the EV charging is something new. And so we want to kind of wade gradually into that area so that, people get kind of, because it's new, we didn't want to come in with, a really heavy hand on that requirement, but we looked at the uses that we thought would generate the highest demand for EV parking. And as Andrew said, with a single family home, you may have an an electric vehicle that you park in your garage, but you do have the ability to put in your own charging station. And people in multifamily dwellings probably don't have that option.
We have one additional question from Chrissy. Could you summarize in plain English the difference between bike parking requirements in the draft ordinance versus what existed before?
Yeah, that's assuming that I can quickly recall what our current bike parking standards are. I know that we currently have long-term and short-term bike parking requirements in our current ordinance. Generally speaking, I think one main difference that I can think of is that in the UDO, the long-term bike parking requirement is generally expressed as a percentage of the total bike parking required rather than breaking down into separate numbers for short-term and long-term, which I think our current ordinance does. Anybody else who can help me on that, I'd appreciate it. That's one difference I can think of.
And we did, I sort of responded within the chat as well. It's kind of it's difficult to go through kind of specific differences because we took the use table or the use matrix that we have in the draft ordinance and tied the bike parking to each of those uses and tried to be more objective in terms of kind of how they're calculated rather than I can see in the current ordinance. There are certain things like per CDOT review, some are a percentage, some are per square feet. So I think it's difficult to go, a one-to-one relationship between the two, just because of the way the ordinance is structured differently now.
Thanks, Arista. And I see Mariah, thank you for answering Linda's question about where to find previous recordings of previous virtual conversations. If you missed that, they are on our website as are most other things that are UDO related. I think we are caught up as far as I can tell with the chat that's been entered. Not seeing anything else. I don't want to take any more of your lunch hour than we need to. If you want to sign off now, feel free to do so. If you have a last minute question, you've got a couple more minutes to put that in the chat and we will be here and we can answer that. Thank you, Eric, for that link. Appreciate that. All right. Thank you all again for being here. We look forward to seeing you in any of our upcoming virtual conversations or any other meetings that we may have on the UDO. So we appreciate your being involved and we urge you to continue to stay involved with this. And put your feedback on our website. Thank you. Okay, I think I just removed the last of the non.
Yeah, I didn't